Hi, I'm Meagan, and you're listening to Catholic versus Protestant.
So tell the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and why.
Sure. So I'm Meagan, as you already know, and I grew up in Ontario, and I grew up in the country, and my parents are both Protestant, but from very different denominations within the Protestant religion. We weren't a particularly overly religious family. We went to church sometimes. I think my parents had a hard time finding a denomination where they both felt comfortable. So we went to the United Church for a long time when I was a kid, because it seemed sort of middle ground. My mum is Anglican. My dad came from the Christian Reformed tradition. They're both immigrants from different countries. And so we went to the United Church for a long time. I did Sunday school with my sister at the United Church, just tiny, tiny country church, not very many kids. And so we did go regularly for a while. I think the community aspect is a hugely important thing for my father, more than the liturgy, whatever liturgy there is in the United Church. And right around when my sister and I could have been confirmed, we just sort of got out of the habit of going to church. I think part of it was there weren't other kids there, really, so we didn't feel inspired to go as far as the community is concerned. And our parents didn't force us. We were often busy on weekends with things to do on the farm, and we just kind of got out of the habit. When I was really small, almost before I can remember, before they had found this United Church, my mum took me and my sister to church occasionally, like at Christmas, just a little Anglican church, but I barely remember those. But then when I went to university, I just felt like I needed something. I needed to find a religious community that I could connect with. And I tried a couple different churches, United, Anglican. And it was funny, at the Anglican church, it was a small church near the campus. I suddenly just felt these familiar things connect with me. So for example, just the responses, "and also with you," or "thanks be to God," that kind of thing, that obviously somewhere in my memory that I couldn't specifically consciously remember, these things were there, and it made me feel comfortable. And so I started going regularly to this small church and eventually was confirmed there much later than an average person being confirmed. And since then I've gone pretty regularly to Anglican services there, and then moving to Montreal, different churches around.
What has your prayer life been like, starting from when your parents taught you to pray at meals and before bed, or if that happened at all? I don't know.
It wasn't regular. We would usually just pray at sort of big family occasions like Thanksgiving, or when lots of the family was around. And it was pretty generic, just sort of ready-made prayers that everybody knew. And often just sort of thanking God for our family and for the food on the table, that kind of thing. And that was usually my dad who would promote that kind of thing. My mum was much more private in her prayer life and didn't really talk about it. Religion has always been a pretty private thing for my mum, and I followed a little bit in her footsteps that way.
But would you pray as a child in bed?
Sometimes. Again, it wasn't a regular every night before bed kind of thing, but I remember sometimes asking God to look out for certain people or help me with things that I was going through in my childhood. When I was in high school, my mum had cancer, and I remember praying about that, even though I wasn't regularly going to a church at that point. So even when we weren't going to church, God was still just sort of this obvious thing that I never really questioned. It was just part of, even though maybe we weren't comfortable as a family with the institution of religion, the faith itself was never questioned.
Was there a relative, an aunt or an uncle that was very devout?
Yeah, my dad's whole side of the family in the Christian Reformed tradition, they are still, most of them, extremely devout and quite I would almost say fundamentalist, like pretty conservative in their beliefs.
Does the Reform encompass Calvinism and all those sorts of things?
Yeah.
Is Presbyterian part of that?
No. Presbyterian, I would say, is more liberal.
Okay.
It certainly has its roots in Calvinism, but I would say the Christian Reformed is much more conservative,
Okay.
generally speaking, and often believing more literally in the Bible and very close-minded as far as women, the role of women, and it's just not very open-minded to outsiders. And if you do something that is considered, for example, my dad divorced from his first wife and he was sort of shunned, and that made him leave the Christian Reformed Church.
Oh.
And eventually his family sort of forgave him and when he married my mother, but that sort of colored his experience with that church. He considers it a little bit hypocritical that they would cast away someone who is going through a really rough time, and he's never really come to terms with that. So yeah, it's that side of things was always a little extreme for my family.
Are they both alive, your parents? Mm-hmm. Okay. Are they getting more religious or less religious?
A little more. They attend an Anglican church now, actually, that they really like. And they go much more regularly than they ever did before. Again, I think the community is the most important part for my dad.
Would he check the Anglican checkbox on a questionnaire now?
Yeah, I think he would. But I don't know if you asked him what is Anglicanism as opposed to United Church or another brand of Protestant church. I don't know if he'd really be able to explain it, but he just knows he's comfortable in that particular space.
Are there still today high Anglican and low Anglican churches?
Very much.
What is the difference?
The liturgy is where you find most of the differences. So in a high Anglican church, more of the service is sung. There's often more bell ringing, there's incense a lot of the time. There's more formality in the liturgy.
Are they closer doctrinally to the Catholic Church than the low Anglican?
Yes, although the doctrines, one could argue that the doctrines in the high Anglican and low Anglican churches are the same.
Okay.
It's just how you express them and how you worship.
But do they mix and mingle and go to each other's churches, or no, it's separated?
It depends on the person. You can, yeah. I go all over the place.
Okay.
I really like the high Anglican service.
So you like the liturgy, the singing more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I love about it.
What are the pros of the low Anglican?
I like this simplicity. I find sometimes in the high Anglican churches, just because of the nature of the liturgy, the people involved in the liturgy end up spending a lot of time worrying about the details of, we have to rehearse the processions and you have to worry about what color all the vestments are and all that kind of thing, which makes it beautiful. But sometimes I think it's easy to spend too much time on that and forget maybe about the actual basic service. And so sometimes my parents' church is quite low and I like going there because it's much simpler.
Okay.
So I'm also a professional singer and I'm singing a lot of the time at church services, and I find that sometimes there's so much music to concentrate on that I don't really participate in the service as a worshiper. So I like the Sundays I have off and I can go either to the same church or to a different one and just pray and be present as a parishioner instead of as someone involved in the liturgy.
You feel like you're distracted, but I think you are in a worship mode when you're singing, right?
Definitely, and it also depends on what you're singing, how well you know it. For example, if it's something you know really well, then you can sort of lose yourself in that experience. Whereas if it's a piece you're sight reading and you're worried about singing the right notes, maybe some part of you is praying, but I think it's harder that way.
I want to talk a little bit more about your personal experience with God and religion. How far have you drifted away in terms of indulging in sin and turning your back on God or being angry with God? Has there been a point in your life where you reached a low point?
I've never really been angry with God. I don't think there's much point in being angry with God. I've certainly had moments in my life where I've felt closer and then further. Part of it actually, I think, is when I feel very involved in a particular church community. I feel like I have a church home, if you will. Then I tend to feel a little bit closer to God. And that's a very personal thing. I don't mean to say that everyone should be connected to a particular church and that's going to help you, but it helps me. And just being part of that liturgical cycle year after year, celebrating the same things, finding new meaning in the same texts. And that helps me feel closer. When I feel less satisfied with a particular place because of some of the people involved, or because I find the music isn't good enough or isn't to my taste, then I feel less close. And I have to work harder personally on my own time, sort of not at church, to feel that connection.
Do you struggle to perfect yourself with a virtue? Is this something that's a conscious project for you? Do you think about the Ten Commandments? Do you do an examination of conscience every day?
No, I don't. I think the thing that I continually work on is my prayer life.
Okay.
That I need to hand over more things to God and not worry so much when I know I can't control certain things. I need to rely on Him more and talk to Him more. As far as actual sin and virtue, to be honest, don't really think about that much, maybe because I haven't gone down into the depths of sin very often. And the Ten Commandments are one thing, but sin, it's as far as the sort of small daily sins that we all commit, they're very personal and it's a matter between you and God. So it's, for me, it's more of just a matter of that prayer and maintaining that relationship one-on-one with God that I need to continue to strive towards.
How many sacraments do you have?
We have 7, but only 2 are necessary for salvation. They divide them into ones that are explicitly performed in the gospel, so that's baptism and Eucharist, and then the rest of them that are not really gospel sacraments, so they're not considered necessary, but they're all done by Anglicans. You can, for example, be anointed as a sick person. There's ordination, there's confirmation, but you don't need them.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the history? It's fascinating. The kings and queens and the Pope, and just what sort of generally what happened?
So, I mean, often people say that the start of the Anglican Church was with King Henry VIII, and theoretically speaking, it was. He broke from the Catholic Church and became the head of the English Church and started this Anglican tradition. However, his view of the Anglican Church was really just a church that he could control that was pretty much the same as the Catholic Church. He just wanted to be able to divorce his wife, basically. The reforms came from Luther, where all the other reforms came from, and were slowly integrated into the church, some in King Henry's time, but more in his son's time, King Edward VI, and after that. So King James I, which is where you get the King James version of the Bible, is really where the doctrines of the Anglican Church began to be really written down and solidified.
How many years since Henry VIII's death was that?
3 generations. So James I was king after Elizabeth I.
Okay. So
she died in 1603, I think.
Between Henry VIII and James, everyone on the throne was Protestant?
No. So King Henry was technically Protestant, but then his son was much more Protestant, as in less Catholic. And then Queen Mary was Catholic. And so there was, I don't remember how long her reign was, but there was a period of time where England was very anti-Protestant. And then her cousin, half-sister, Elizabeth I became queen, and she was Protestant, although she was not as anti-Catholic as Edward VI was. So there was a little bit more leeway as far as, and freedom of religion.
Less bloodshed, maybe?
Yeah, less bloodshed for sure.
What are the numbers of people killed explicitly for their religion?
I don't know.
That period?
I don't know.
10 people, 10,000, 10 million?
I would say more like 10,000 as far as...
Okay.
I mean, even in Queen Elizabeth's time, there were lots of persecutions of Catholics, and I think it was unclear for a lot of time how illegal Catholicism was, and so there were secret masses and music that was composed illegally for the Catholic Church. And with James I, I think it became more clear what the boundaries were. And Protestantism was the rule of the day.
Who are the good guys in that sort of lineage? Like who are the shining heroes, even if it's a false assessment of history, but what is the assessment, generally speaking, in the mainstream?
As far as religion is concerned? Or
yeah, in religion and in the secular world, who are seen as the heroes and the villains of that sort of succession?
Queen Mary, for sure, is seen as a villain, partly because of how many people she killed, and I think also she wasn't considered a very good ruler. She also wasn't a ruler for very long. Elizabeth I is obviously a great heroine. She was great for the country and a little more open-minded about religion, which I think is what people wanted.
Henry VIII himself was seen as a buffoon or a fool, or what?
A little bit of a fool, I think, because of his 6 wives, more than for his religious beliefs. He was a very devout Catholic, and his decision to part with the church was, I think, probably more influenced by his Protestant-leaning advisors and wife at the time. He did quite a lot of good things for England, but he's generally seen as a villain because of the way he treated his wives.
How do you, as an Anglican, see St. Thomas More? Is he accurately depicted, do you think?
Yeah, I see him as a good man who died for his principles in a very confusing time when the average person couldn't really tell you what was right and what was wrong according to the realm.
Did that crystallize some of that ambiguity, do you think, for the rest of history that was to flow from that?
I think so, partly because King Henry and Thomas More were friends more than anything. So at that point, I don't think King Henry VIII had been known to be particularly ruthless in his punishment of enemies until that point, where, well, if this guy can kill his really good friend, then watch out. You know, maybe we're in uncharted territory, basically, as far as religion is concerned. I mean, they used to discuss theology in a very jovial fashion. They liked to talk about it and they liked to argue about it and had many similar beliefs. So I think more than about the religion itself, it was a line in the sand about how ruthless this king could be.
And who came before him?
His father, his older brother was supposed to be king and may have even been king for a very short time now. I can't remember. No, I don't think he was. But his brother died when he was quite young.
What was the father's name?
Henry.
Henry the
7th.
Okay.
Yeah. And his father was the first of their line, the Tudors, and considered by many to be sort of upstarts. They weren't particularly royal in their family connections, but because of different marriages and some battles that they won, I think it was Henry VII's father who sort of got them on the royal track.
What sort of ethnic stock did they come from?
Welsh, partly Welsh, and
English,
which was a mixture of Norman and Saxon and...
Okay. It's already mixed up by that point.
Yeah.
And how old is England at that time?
It's hard to say. I mean, England, as we know it, as far as the royal lineage is concerned, sort of began in 1066. This is when William the Conqueror came from Normandy and sort of united the kingdom. But there were many people living there long before that who had their own duchies and kingdoms. Okay. And even before that, there were the Celtic people native to the islands who lived there. So it's hard to say how old it is.
One last historic question for you. I know you're not an expert, you're just an amateur. You love that part of history, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a golden age of the monarchy in England? Is there a high watermark in the English monarchy? Even if it's only in your own opinion.
Yeah, I guess in my opinion, Elizabeth I would be a pretty high mark because she won a couple of big battles against the Spanish, who were always threatening England. So she kind of got rid of that threat. And she sort of calmed down the Scottish question, one could argue in a not very nice way, but she just made things feel more settled and peaceful. in the territory of England.
This segues nicely into my next line of questioning, which has to do with you as a woman. Can you just talk about what it means to be a woman and to be religious generally, in general, for you?
What I like about being a woman in the Anglican Church is that there's freedom for women. We can be priests, we can be bishops, depending on which area, but most areas in the developed world. So yeah, I like that there can be women in authority in the Anglican Church, that it's generally regarded as equal, and there are many women in authority.
Is Queen Elizabeth II the head of your church?
Yes, it's a different kind of hierarchy than the Catholic Church.
She doesn't claim infallibility or anything.
It's more of a sort of bureaucratic hierarchy. The Archbishop of Canterbury is considered the sort of leader of the Anglican Church, but also not in the same way as the Pope. He sort of is the political leader, you could say, even though it's not politics, it's church, but he doesn't claim any extra connection to God just because he's the Archbishop. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church bothers me a little bit. It's one reason why I feel like I couldn't be Catholic. One big reason, because it makes people unequal.
We're all equal in dignity, and we're all equal in terms of being completely dependent on God for grace. Since we're talking about women, what role does Mary play in the Anglican Church?
It depends on what church you go to or what kind of person you are. Some high Anglican churches pray to Mary and have altars to Mary and just are
statues, icons, the whole works?
Very similar to Catholic Church.
Do you have a rosary? Do you pray the rosary? Not you personally, but is it permitted to pray the rosary?
Other Anglican churches barely talk about her, especially the lower ones. In general, the Anglican Church regards her as the mother of Christ, but doesn't regard her as a deity.
Nobody regards her as a deity.
I know that, but just to clarify,
okay.
It's not. She doesn't
I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure there's someone out there that does. Yeah.
Again, this is an aspect of the Anglican Church that I like, is that there's a lot of leeway in what you believe in the doctrine. There's a lot of gray area, and you can choose things that suit you personally.
Are you allowed to believe that Mary was not a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ?
Are you allowed to believe?
I'm not allowed to believe that.
Right.
Are you?
You know, I'm not actually sure about that.
You should look into it. Maybe you don't have as much leeway as you think you have.
Right. No, I mean, yeah.
Because there are a lot of Catholics I meet that think they have a lot of leeway, but they're just ignorant of what the church teaches.
Right.
So there are a lot of Catholics I meet that think that they have leeway to choose if they want to go to Mass on Sunday or not, but they don't have a choice. They have to go to Mass, but they just don't know that they have to go.
Right.
So it's not leeway, it's ignorance. So there may be some of that.
I'm sure there's some of that in what I don't know exactly.
Yeah. All graces, they come to us through Mary. She's the neck. Christ is the head, the church is the body, and Mary is the neck. And all the graces flowing from Christ the head to Christ the body go through the neck, which is Mary. So she's the mediatrix of all graces. And that's a strong doctrine. It might be the case that the Anglicans believe the same thing, or they may have jettisoned that.
Yeah, they don't. Again, I'm pretty sure it's one of those things that you can pray to Mary as a mediator to God, but it's not necessary.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Anglican Church, of course, obliges you to believe in the Trinity, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So there's no leeway there.
No.
Okay. So on a personal level, who are you most drawn to in terms of praise, in terms of petition, thanksgiving, or all the aspects of prayer?
I think probably most often I'm praying to God the Father, but I'm often asking for God to send His Holy Spirit in a particular direction or to someone in particular, especially actually when I'm worshiping and I'm singing. I tend to translate that kind of prayer as the Holy Spirit because it's just more sensual in a way. Around Easter, when we're specifically talking about Jesus and His crucifixion, then I spend a lot more time talking to Jesus specifically. And when I'm looking for compassion, I think more about Jesus. But often it really is a combination, I guess, as it should be.
Yeah. What about the passion and the sufferings of Christ? The Catholic Church is frowned upon by a lot of other Christian denominations because of our emphasis on suffering and death. It's not the whole story, but it's a significant part of the story. Can you talk a little bit about the sufferings of Christ?
Yeah, I mean, in the Anglican Church, one can choose during Holy Week, for example, to really engage in that side and really go find a service to go to every day. You can do Stations of the Cross at many Anglican churches.
Okay.
Some of them on Good Friday do like a contemplation of the crucifix, but it's definitely not something that everyone feels comfortable with, as you were saying. And a lot of Anglicans will just go Easter Sunday morning and celebrate the resurrection. Inherent in the Anglican service, even if it's not a required sacrament, inherent in the liturgy of every Anglican church is a general collective confession every week, every Mass. So you are confronted with that. You say it all together and the priest absolves you before you take your communion. So it is sort of Catholic light, like it's a little, it's because you're doing it everyone together. Maybe you don't, certainly I don't every week confront specifically the suffering or my suffering or the things that I've done wrong, but it is something you go through each time you go to Mass.
Yeah, I think the Catholic theologians are fond of referring to that as a virtual intention. So there's a sort of set it and forget it mentality that we have. When I converted in 2009, I was confronted with a whole host of set prayers, especially when I was just a monotheist. I didn't believe in the Trinity. I didn't believe in the Incarnation, but I was entering the Catholic Church nonetheless because I needed to worship God. I did my rigorous analysis and I prayerfully looked at the prayer and said, it seems okay, don't worry about it, and I just pray it. And a lot of new prayers that I encounter, I think about it deeply, but not every time. I just sort of make sure it's okay, that I understand it, maybe do a couple of passes to get deeper insight, maybe read what the saints have said about this prayer. And then I can just pray it without thinking about it too much. And I think that's normal. And I think it's the same thing with liturgy in the Mass. You can sort of, to a certain extent, go through the motions and it's okay because there is that virtual intention.
What about the Credo? You just didn't say the Credo when you first started going to Mass?
Well, I did undergo 6 months of education, Catholic education,
Okay.
to accept intellectually the Trinity and the Incarnation.
Okay.
So the way that I did it is sort of like the way that I approach my love life. I married a woman without knowing everything about her. I took a leap of faith. I trusted her. I said, well, seems to be that I'm drawn to this woman and there's probably a reason for that. And I want to give myself to her. So instead of proving that it's safe, I'm just going to give myself to her. And then time will tell.
Right.
And 21 years later, I'm still married to her. I'm happy. She's not so happy that I'm Catholic, but but it's the same thing with religion. I said I'm drawn to worship God. I don't have a choice. I have to worship. As soon as I realized that God is God, I had to worship Him publicly. So I took the leap of faith and I, for pragmatic reasons, joined Christianity. And to me, Christianity is the Catholic Church. So I joined the Catholic Church. And I've questioned everything since, and I continue to question, and I'm still ready to leave Christianity. I'm ready. No regrets. I don't want to believe a lie.
So what do you think would be a game changer? Like what would be the thing that would make you leave? Contradiction.
If they dogmatically permit the ordination of women, I will leave Christianity because they've already dogmatically forbidden the ordination of women. That's within the realm of religion. Within the realm of science, when I talk to atheists, I'm often told that I have confirmation bias and that I'll never leave my faith because I will just always interpret everything in a way that's favorable to what I want to believe.
Right.
But I come back with the answer that it wouldn't take much to falsify my Christianity with natural science. Show me that the human race does not descend from one human pair. If you can convince me of polygenism, I will leave Christianity, because it's a dogma of my church that we come from one human pair, that all humans descend from one human pair. If that's not true, then Christianity is a false religion, period. So my dogmatic faith, and my faith is dogmatic, it's based on revealed truths, many of which I can't prove or disprove. But there's a whole web of dogmas, and they're all interconnected. And if one of them is contradicted by the church or by science, then the whole house of cards collapses. So it's very telling that my religion is the only religion that puts its neck on the line and says, this is the truth, it always was the truth, and it always will be the truth. And if we ever contradict ourselves, it's a false religion. I don't know any other religion that does that.
So, going specifically to Adam and Eve for a second, how literally do you take the Bible?
There's a lot of wiggle room in terms of interpretation, but there are principles that guide interpretation. One of the principles is that we first look at the literal meaning of any given passage. And on top of that literal interpretation, there are other spiritual readings and more symbolic meanings, okay? Now, having said that, it may not be the case that the particular passage we're looking at literally took place as it's described. And a good example of that is the two creation stories in Genesis.
Right. That's what I was specifically at.
Because we cannot take both stories at face value, we have to conclude there's something higher that's being described here. And therefore, we reject the literal interpretation in those points where there's contradiction. Logic forces us to reject the literal, but we still have the symbolic and the spiritual reading. So which parts can we rely on in terms of that literal interpretation? An example that springs to mind is Adam and Eve, that we do spring from one couple. Another example is John 6. The church has dogmatically said that he meant it, literally, that we are eating his body, blood, soul, and divinity. That's how we put it. That it's really, truly, and actually present under the appearances of bread and wine. So that's an example of a Bible passage that gets the stamp of approval for its literal interpretation. But they're very, very few.
Right. And these stamps of approval are made by men or humans, right?
Humans are the instrument. The men that penned infallible scripture. They were men, but they were inspired and they were protected from teaching error concerning faith and morals when they put their pen to parchment. If you're comfortable with that, then you should be just as comfortable with papal infallibility. If you're not comfortable with papal infallibility, then you should also be uncomfortable with the inerrancy of the Bible. Do you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible?
No, not at all.
Okay. What sets the Bible apart from any other religious book or self-help book?
Part of it is its age, its historical tradition.
Is this your opinion or is this the Anglican teaching?
This is my opinion.
Okay.
Anglicans generally argue that the four Gospels are the Word of God written through these four men. The rest of it is inspired by God, but not necessarily the Word of God.
Okay.
And so I appreciate the Bible very much as some of it being the Word of God and a lot of it being historical information, a lot of it being historical traditions that have been passed down through generations. But I really do think that all of it needs to be examined and not taken. I'm not saying that you're taking it at face value, but I think a lot of traditions do, and I really disagree with that.
There's a hierarchy in the Catholic Church, a hierarchy of dogmatic truth. So it wouldn't make much sense to get excited about the divinity of Christ and then undermine the very notion of God, right? So the divinity of Christ hangs or depends on the reality of God. And so on and so forth. There's this whole network of dogmas or teachings or doctrines that hang together in a web, but some are more fundamental than others. And I think that if you're an atheist, you also have a set of dogmas which are in a hierarchy. And if you're a Hindu, you have a set of dogmas. And if you're a Scientologist, you have a set of dogmas. And if you're an Anglican, you probably have a set of dogmas. So there's no difference there in kind. There's only a difference in degree and in which particular beliefs you put where and how you hang them all together in your little hierarchy. So you believe in the Trinity. We've already established that. The Anglican Church believes in the Trinity. And if you stop believing in the Trinity, you stop being an Anglican. I think there are many, many dogmas in the Anglican Church that hang together, and infallibility is in there somewhere. It is in there somewhere. If not, the whole thing is meaningless, just like I said with God, and we can't throw away the most fundamental aspects. God is infallible. Religion is connecting to God, so you would expect infallibility in religion, right?
One thing I have trouble agreeing with the Catholic Church is society in general has changed since the beginning of time. And things that used to be law are now no longer law, and for good reason. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Like contraception, that the Catholic Church is against. I have an issue with that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that maybe used to be more generally believed, that contraception is a bad thing, but times have changed, and it's an important, I think, good thing that's out there for women to use. And why does the Catholic Church hang on to this, what I think is an old-fashioned view that actually seems to harm women in a lot of ways?
If I disagreed with their stance on contraception, I would have no qualms with walking away from Christianity. The principle is life. Are you pro-life, or you are pro-life? Okay. So the principle is
pro-choice. Sorry, I'm pro-choice.
Oh, you're pro-choice. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're pro-choice. Okay. So the principle is life. We have a human nature, which God gave us. It wasn't scientists that gave us our human nature, and it wasn't a pile of swamp water that was struck by lightning that gave us our human nature. It was God that gave us our human nature. He designed us with a purpose, to be happy and to be fulfilled and to partake in his life forever. So it's good news. They call it good news for a reason, right?
Exactly.
It's the good news. So life, we are made with a human nature, and we need to correspond with that human nature. So we can't cheat the system. We can't go against our human nature. And sexuality is real. It's good. But if we pervert it or make it something it's not, we try to isolate one aspect and reject another aspect or deny an aspect, there are consequences, and we need to be careful about that. Just like if you take your pen and you have a can of baked beans and you want to open your can with your pen, you're going to ruin the pen and you're not going to open the can. So there's a sort of respect that you need to have for your tools, and a respect you need to have in an analogous way for your body and for sexuality. What is it? What is it made for? And if we twist it, no matter how much pleasure we get in the moment, there will be negative consequences. So when God forbids us from doing something which is pleasurable, it's because the long-term consequences are bad for us. And that could be confusing because we're short-sighted and we love pleasure. So sex has a unitive function and the procreative function, and they're both essential, and we can't separate those. We can't ignore one without consequences. So that's the sort of medium short answer. Has to do with our human nature, it has to do with goodness, and it has to do with life and maximizing our happiness in the long term. Because there's a way that seems right to man, but its end is destruction. And we are free. We can follow our instinct and we can follow our gut. But I think we're better off listening to God.
I like your answer. Where I find it problematic is in cases where this unity, this partnership that is inherent in sexuality isn't equal. And
It sounds like you're saying that women are sort of a passive receptacle for men's semen, and it's just like, oh no, here comes more pregnancy juice or something like that.
Pregnancy juice. In some cases.
I don't think this is the primary motivation for having contraception. I think the primary motivation is sex is fun, but responsibility is not so fun. Right?
Well,
it's not like there are a bunch of big, strong, muscly men raping their wives daily, and oh, if only I didn't have 13 kids, it would be a little bit less wearisome on my body and on my energies.
I have no idea what the numbers are, and I should hope that that's not the norm.
In the Western world, women are pretty
definitely.
Women are pretty much in control. I wouldn't.
We could argue that too, but but I agree with you. In the Western world, it's way less of an issue, but in other parts of the world, I think it's much more of an issue.
I would like to go to the heart of the issue and sit down with your macho bully husband and your timid, submissive rape victim wife. Do you love and respect and honor the dignity of this your fellow human being that you married ceremoniously with your family and friends present? I mean, come on. This is a basic level of education that we need to address. We can't just throw them some condoms. We need to get to the heart of the humanity of this big bully. And I'm not denying that there are these big macho bullies with more testosterone than brain cells. But we need to go to the heart of the issue. Otherwise, it's just going to be rape with a condom.
That's true. We do need to go to the heart of the issue. But in the meantime, like the heart of the issue is something that will obviously take more time to educate and tease out.
Yeah.
And I just feel like in the meantime, there's a lot of abuse happening.
Sexuality is a really, really, really hot topic whenever Catholicism is brought up. Whether it's the deviant sexual behavior of those who are in the priesthood, God help them, or whether it's the hypocritical behavior of the people in the pews who are silently complicit with the dogmas of the church, but secretly sleeping with their secretary or using contraception at home or masturbating, whatever it is. I'm not here to judge anyone. God knows our animal passions are difficult to tame. If we don't give ourselves to God completely, it's a losing battle. But there is hypocrisy in the church, and that doesn't help when it comes to trying to sell the church to non-Catholics, or when it comes to apologizing for the behavior of the pedophile priests or the idiots in the pews. It's an uphill battle trying to do PR for this church.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Any church
Yeah.
hypocrisy, of course. No, and I don't mean to be too argumentative about it.
No.
It's just one of these sort of thorny issues that I find problematic with the Catholic Church. So it's just interesting to hear how you think about it and how the church thinks about it.
Yeah, I tend to be conservative by nature, so it was easy for me to accept all the dogmas of the Catholic Church, whereas a lot of people I meet, it's a stumbling block for them because they're part of a world that's very sexually liberated. And I sympathize with them. I sympathize with the homosexuals who think that love is love, and love is love. I encourage them to love each other. Just don't have sex with each other. Do you think it's okay to have sex outside of marriage?
Yes.
Okay. Is that the position of the Anglican Church?
I don't know.
Is there a resource where I can go and find out what the Anglican Church teaches?
Yeah, I used to have a book that explained some of these catechisms in the Anglican Church. There's not like one sort of resource, though.
Who are some of the heroes of Anglicanism that speak for Anglican theology and Anglican ecclesiology? Do you have saints? But do you have saints which are specifically Anglican?
The earliest one that came up with the three-legged stool of Anglicanism is Richard Hooker. He was very early. I think he was in the 16th century already. And so Anglicanism was just being established. But that three-legged stool that he came up with is an important part of the Anglican theology. Scriptures, reason, and tradition.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
In your personal life, have you found yourself tending to maybe downplay your faith just to fit in a little bit better? Is that something that has ever happened to you?
Yeah, a little bit. If someone specifically asks me about my faith, I will answer truthfully and tell them what I believe and say that I go to church on Sundays. But if I'm not asked specifically, I will often not talk about it. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I think it's an issue that is often fraught with tension, and a lot of people have strong opinions one way or the other. And I don't like making people feel uncomfortable, so I tend to step away from talking about it unless I'm specifically asked.
Would you ever step in to defend Jesus Christ if he's being maligned in public?
Yes.
Has it happened?
Yes.
Okay.
And Christians in general, sometimes, I will step in and say, well, yes, that's true, but that's not all Christians, that kind of comment. Or, yes, Christians did that in the past, but there's also a lot of good that the Christian church has done. That kind of defending I will also eagerly do.
Have you even got so far as to defend the Catholic Church?
Well, in the fact that the Catholic Church was the church historically, yes.
That's nice.
Yeah.
At the end of my interviews, I always ask my guests to wrap up. So just as a closing thought to the people that are out there, what would you say? Religion
and belief, I think, is a very personal thing. And what I find especially helpful in my religion is that personal connection that we were talking about between me and God. No matter how I choose to manifest it or worship, that is, I think, the most important thing about any religion that I know about. And if you can find comfort in that personal connection, even if it's not with a God, but with a force or even another human being, feeling connected with something or someone is the best way to find love and to find compassion. And I think that should be the goal for everyone in their lives, is to find ways to connect to other humans, to connect to a deity, to connect to the universe. When it comes down to it, that's what religion is doing, is giving you a way to connect to something other than yourself. And I encourage anyone to do that. I think it's important.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you've got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.